Hello, this is Chai Across Generations. I'm Shankar.
And I'm Nikhil. This is episode 11, Communication. What's the endgame?
We are at the end of this series on intergenerational communication. In the first two parts, we talked about what communication is, why it's important, and the power of listening thoughtfully and asking questions.
In this episode, we're going to conclude the conversation and see how communication can take vastly different directions, like a sweet chai or a bitter black coffee.
We share some personal stories of communicating within our families to illustrate how we've dealt with some communication challenges ourselves. So here we go.
So let's say you're a parent, your kid says something about a social issue that you might not fully agree with, or you might have something to say, but instead of offering that opinion right away, why not ask them why they feel so strongly about that issue? Why not ask them the stories that went behind that, right? Have them open up, have them share. If you can help them feel seen and heard, then you can maybe start to open up the conversation and share your own perspectives. I'll give you a personal story around this from this past week, actually. So just want to say, this idea of talking to your parents, of trying to chat better with your parents, is something that is, I think, a lifelong journey. I'm still figuring out. I was talking to my parents this week, not about a social issue, but about a challenging situation in a different part of my life. And there's not a lot to be done in this situation. It's just kind of a waiting game, and it's just a kind of waiting to see how things play out. So I'm in this space where for the next week or two, I'm just kind of waiting to see how things turn out. There's a lot of kind of nerves and anxiety in the air. So when I was talking to them, I was telling my parents about the situation, and I was just feeling kind of down about it, right? It's a tough situation for me and a lot of people around me. And I just wanted to feel through those feelings. But in that conversation, my parents initially, they wanted to make me feel better. That protective instinct came out, right? That love came out in that way, and they were surfacing kind of positives that were going on, other things that were positive in that area. But I couldn't hear it, right? Because what I wanted was just to be heard, and not, I didn't think there was anything to fix. I feel like things will be fine at the end of the situation, but I'm just sitting in it right now, and I just want someone to hear me. And so this interaction went on for a little while, and at one point in the interaction, I felt like that my parents wanted to offer, these kind of pieces of these stories from their own lives, right? Of when they'd been in something similar or whatever else. And while their points were correct, I was not in the space to receive it. And what I wish had happened was, since I was kind of in a tough place at the beginning of the conversation, I wish they had maybe asked something along the lines of, how can we help? Right? Because there's like advice giving, and there's just listening. And I actually, so that we ended that interaction. Didn't feel great about it. Typically, I would have just thought, okay, bad interaction, that's fine. Wash it away. I'll talk to them later. But actually, I have to credit this podcast, and I have to credit our listeners for this too. And I have to credit you for this. The next day, I kind of thought, I need to go back to them. I need to check in with them on this conversation, because if we're sitting here talking about intergenerational conversations and trying to improve our relationship, I need to do some of that myself. So I talked to them the next day, and I asked them, how do you think that conversation went? I was just curious what they thought. And actually, it turns out they had done some reflecting, the two of them together, after that conversation. And then they were sharing back with me. They said, I think you were looking for something different in that conversation than what we gave to you. And my mom made this point where she said, I wish I had asked you, are you looking for advice, or are you looking to be heard? Right? Which is great. A great kind of realization. And it would have really helped me. I was happy. I wasn't perfect in this conversation by any means. I'm sure I could have done better as well. But we talked about this idea, my parents and I, that I want to bring here, which is that I think for my parents' generation, for your generation, especially coming from India, it is not normal or an easily learned behavior to ask questions of your kids during some of these conversations. right? The impulse is, if they're struggling, let me try to help them, right? Let me offer some advice. Let me offer an opinion. I don't want to see them hurt or in pain. And that's a great instinct, and it's oftentimes correct. But sometimes, maybe you can help me out here, but the power of the question, if you can incorporate questioning as a parent or as a child, but in this case, for my parents, if you can incorporate questioning as a parent, it will open up a ton of conversations with your kids.
Great points. I think when I've encountered older people and presented something to them, shared an experience, I've never felt good when they've tried to fix it.
Right. Yes. Beautifully said.
And as an engineer, I realize I also like to fix things. Right.
Right.
But somehow, very luckily, with my daughter, I've learned to first sit with it before and perhaps I realize there is a hubris in actually thinking I can fix anything because I respect that she's an adult. She's a fully functioning adult. She has all the intelligence she needs to take the right decisions, right? And I realized this very, very early on when she was very young. So I've been lucky in that one respect. I don't think I'm that good with other people, but with her, I'm somehow all right.
That's
probably
wonderful.
even with my parents, I try to fix. I might try to fix something for my
Sure.
mom,
Yeah.
right? But in that respect, I'm lucky. But there is also something that I learned from our podcast, which I was not doing very well, which is being a professor. And as you all guys, you know, and our listeners know, I have a tendency to go into long, voluble theories and have an opinion on everything. It's the worst thing about being an academic is they have an opinion on anything and everything, regardless of whether
The
they
worst
know.
or the best, Junker? I'm not sure.
Regardless of the depth of our knowledge, we'll be happy to venture an opinion on something.
That's why I like asking questions to you. I know you'll have something to come back to me on.
Right? So sometimes I have launched off on some theory without fully listening to my daughter, and she'd get upset, and we would, it's palpable, right? Emotionally, I can see that. But the nice thing is, we'd always come back, and the fact that we do love each other very much, and we'll reopen it, right? So I'll ask, okay, so I'm sorry, I think it seems like you're upset. What's the deal? And we go through it again. So just like you said, and eventually it comes out. So we're able to listen. I'm able to listen. Primarily, it's most often it's I am the one who's not doing the listening, and I'm not too proud to admit that, and it works out then. So then I listen and I'm able to see her viewpoint. And here's the other interesting thing. I have learned that you can understand even if you don't agree.
Right.
So at the end of the conversation, it does not mean that I agree with her necessarily. We can still agree to disagree respectfully, and I can understand that her lens is different, her perspective is different, her life is different, the things she's experiencing are different. And we say provisionally, and she's given me a great compliment once. She says, I do respect the fact that you have a lot more experience. And so I'm not going to discard your opinion in the trash. I'm going to keep it as provisionally a useful perspective that I may revisit in some form down the line. But right now, it's not something that I'm able to accept, and it doesn't gel with my interpretation of reality as I see it. And to me, that's progress. I mean, that's huge. I'm just happy with that.
Yeah.
That's totally, I'm good enough with that.
Yeah.
Right.
That's wise. That's very wise. And thoughtful, I guess. Considerate. Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I'm glad you shared that, and I'm glad we could highlight this idea of coming back to it, which is a theme in the story you just shared and the story I shared earlier. And frankly, I don't always do that. That's something I want to get better at. This podcast and our conversations are helping me lean into those, especially, say, with my parents and with others of your generation. I think that's a really good point. Let me ask you this. This is maybe a bit of a hot take that I'm forming in my head, and you can walk me off the ledge or step me down from the ledge here. So I think we're hitting on the fact that listening and asking questions is important for both generations, right? For parents to be able to figure out when to give advice versus when to listen, for kids to not jump to conclusions when your parents might have a different opinion, especially on a social issue, an important social issue to them. Given that it's important and we need to build this skill,
Right.
how do we do that? And in some ways, I'm thinking which party needs to move first between those two, the parent and the child. I'm thinking that it maybe need to come from the parent more because they are still role modeling for the kid. And we talked about parents, we emulate what our parents do. So that is a good way to spread the influence. But I don't want to just, put it on parents to start doing that. How do you think about that question?
It's a great question. And I'm going to walk you back off the ledge.
Please do.
So I think the label of parents and children is too broad. So if I can go off on a tangent,
Please.
I'm going to give you two underlying frameworks that help me. So they come from yoga philosophy, and they are actually in the Bhagavad Gita, and they form a very important part of our spiritual tradition. And it's something called the guna theory. So you might have heard of it. There are three gunas: sattva, rajas, tamas, that form all of us, right? So sattva is like a light and illumination and intelligence and ability to see things from another person's viewpoint, a compassion, etc., etc., right? Rajas is like a passion, a drive. It could be desire, lust, activity, etc., right? And tamas is rest. It could be inertia. It could be endurance. A more static state, ignorance, right? So they can have both positive and negative attributes. These gunas, as I've listed them, you can see sort of positive and negative attributes. And I think every parent and child has a different combination of these. So I don't think we can say that a whole party has to move this way. I think it really depends on the interaction.
Right.
So in some cases the parents have to move, in some cases the child has to move, right?
Right.
I do agree that parents do have to model better, but there can be situations where they model and the child is its guna balance is not good enough to see it, and
Right.
you have a situation. The other question that you asked, so I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask you a question in return.
Okay.
This question of how do we improve. So what helped me is to get away from the parent-child interaction, because that's so charged with emotions, and look at a friendship that you formed. Let's say you made a friend 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? And I found that when two people agree, friendship seems easy, right? But when two people disagree, then what are the necessary requirements for friendship to survive, or better still, thrive?
When two people disagree as friends, what conditions are necessary for that relationship to survive or thrive?
Right.
Yeah.
And the reason
That's a
I
good
think it's
question.
important is the friendship is disposable, right? You can always unfriend somebody,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But the principles which we use there could then help us in relationships which we cannot turn off
Right.
or disown.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'll share with you what's coming to my
Yeah,
mind just
sure.
as a first reaction, but I'd love for you to share yours as well after. There's communication is a big piece of it, like being able to communicate where someone is, what they're feeling. And actually, this leads me into something I was thinking about too. A big condition of that friendship surviving is what emotions are permissible within this friendship and in these interactions. Because I think for a lot of interactions, relationships, happiness, joy, curiosity are universally accepted, right? And encouraged, and we can keep talking forever about that. But what happens when a friend and I start talking to or experiencing sadness, misery, depression, uncertainty? Is there space for that in the conversation? And if there is space for that, to talk about it, and this is where questions come in too, because if you're feeling sad, I don't want to just say, Shankar, be happy. I want to say, Shankar, what's making you sad, right? Um, I think that is maybe the most important piece of that relationship surviving and thriving. I think it also, to your point, levels up or layers up into the parent interaction as well.
Right.
Because when I think about that interaction with my parents that I was sharing, I think there's a part of it where some of the sadder emotions are harder to talk about in that parent-child relationship, right? Like, if as a parent, I'm just putting myself in a parent's shoes, and you can corroborate this, if you see your child sad or upset or disappointed, you want to maybe fix, right? When maybe your kid just wants you to listen, and if you can find a way to listen, or at least figure out if you're going to fix mode or listen mode, then if listening to sadness and other sad emotions becomes something your relationship can hold, you have now unlocked a better relationship, right? And a deeper intergenerational communication. So maybe my answer started with the friendship and moved back to the parent-child, which maybe you're trying to move us away from. But what would you say to that?
It's a beautiful point. I had not thought of that, honestly. And I think it is absolutely sitting well with my empirical data gathering. uh, so just you're absolutely right. When my daughter calls me and if I find that she's upset or whatever, my probably first instinct is to find ways to help.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain things that just have to play out, and denying them or trying to always put a light on them, it doesn't work. It just has to play out. We just have to. And so sometimes we'll just agree to sleep on it. It's like, okay, I'm not feeling so great today, why don't you sleep on it, we'll talk tomorrow, right? Which is after having had the full conversation. I'm not saying that that's a way to shut down somebody, but when you find that after the full conversation, this is the emotion, this is the predominant emotion right now, there's nothing that we can do or say to change this. We're going to sit with it, and it's going to change, it's going to pass, and the morning will be better, and we'll revisit the conversation. So I like your very, very important point of what emotions the friendship can hold. I wanted to add two things that came to my mind after I asked that question. One is ascribing intention. And I think that if we encounter some very radically different viewpoint, let's say, you say something and let's say it concerns racism or some hot button social justice issue, and your friend comes back with an opinion that seems completely contrary to what you think is a right or acceptable or a reasonable opinion, right? The question is, are we then immediately ascribing intention to that opinion? Is that intention bad? Does the person have and I think every time that I've not done that, it's helped me reach back out to clarify the intention. So again, leads to questioning, like, why did you say that? Like, what did you mean by that? What were your experiences that lead you to form this opinion?
Right.
Right. And I think the other point is when we reach, and this is more speaking to the point where it may not survive, and definitely will not thrive, is when we reach a limit of understanding. So I think we all have a desire to be understood. But suppose I reach deep into an interaction with you and I find that I'm saying something that you just cannot understand, right? But worse still, you may be telling me something that contradicts my lived experience. Then I think you hit a real wall, and then it becomes a real challenge to go back to that friendship, because A, you've not felt understood, and two, they're telling you something that's contradicting your lived experience. And I'm sure younger generation also feels this, if they don't feel understood and something contradicts their lived experience, that's a shutdown, right? And so I think to be at least sensitive to keeping that space open, I think is the only way to help a friendship survive, and then re-engaging, and then there may be other things that flower and blossom that help it thrive eventually.
Right. Yeah. It also makes me think of the fact that there are certain conversations where it almost feels like the other person has a high ground on you. If you perceive that they're saying, I am smarter than you because I'm older. I am smarter than you because I'm got a better education, right? Or more educated, whatever it is. Those type of things, when those come in, that's why I think where the shutdown comes in oftentimes.
Right.
Of and there's some of that in the parent-child interaction. If a parent were to say something like, "I just know more than you. I'm older than you, and therefore this is the way to do it." They might be right even, but like framed in that way, I don't think my generation is as receptive to that, and younger generations than mine are not as receptive to that, which is probably a shift, right? Than maybe the way you grew up and with your parents.
Right. And I agree with you that in the end, if I felt my ultimate goal was to come to peace with my parents more than to always agree with them on everything.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think a part of it brings me to this other point, which is the opposite of communication. That sometimes is it more important to come to peace and even accept a different viewpoint and yet affirm that there is love and connection rather than trying to keep communicating and somehow, get through, because I've realized sometimes there are just limits to what things can be communicated. Sometimes talking makes things worse. Sometimes it's important to have a distance in time and space and words and
Right.
thoughts. Um, because whether we like it or not, I think our parents and children live rent free in our heads for a long time.
Right.
Um, and sometimes, probably the only way to be kind is to just suspend that maybe desire to thrash everything out right then and there. But sometimes accept that, okay, this is how they think, this is how I think, but I'm at peace with that. It's still, I can still navigate and interact with them on the important things. And to me, that's become increasingly important as I grow older. I
Right.
mean, my mother is 85. I know there are some things that we may never see eye to eye on, or that she may never understand, and that's okay. I mean, I think I can hold that and still affirm that there is a lot of affection and there is a lot of caring and there's a lot of communication. And for
Right.
me, that was important.
Yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to layer on top of that, especially when it's in the realm of family or friends,
Right,
and you're in this space. It can be very difficult. It can be very challenging.
right,
We talked about on a previous conversation the premium placed on family in
right.
South Asian communities, right? So when you have differences of opinion or disagreements and you're making decisions like the one you're talking about of how do I interact with this person, to what extent am I, keeping this communication open, or is it good to, figure out another way to have this interaction with them? I think that can be hard. It can create some pressure
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good point, right? And one that um, can create a bit of turmoil,
Mm-hmm.
given the context of South Asian communities. I mean, really all communities, right? Family is important in a lot of communities, but I think especially resonates in the South Asian community.
Right. So, Nikhil, I have spoken on with my perspective, and I'm sure there's a million other perspectives on this that I would love to hear from our listeners through their
Yes.
feedback, don't you think? And I've very much enjoyed your perspective. It's added so much value through the conversation. You could hear the times when I had aha moments, and that was
Yeah.
really valuable. So, thank you so much for that. And I'm also looking forward to things that we could learn from others who engage with us through this
Yeah,
podcast.
absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to add one last thing off of that, Shankar, which is you and I are still works in progress on this. Um, the things we've talked about here in these conversations are things we've thought about and have had the benefit of talking to one another about, right, in order to get clear on how we feel. So I'm very grateful that we have this space. And I just hope uh, we can leave our listeners here with a sense of hope or optimism that by talking about these things, by listening to these things, by maybe taking something you've heard in this conversation and applying it in your own life, whether it's asking a question or trying to listen differently or anything else that's come up here, that's a big step. And I'm inspired by all the people that are thinking in that way. So I just want to say this is not, easy or straightforward. We are all trying to figure it out. And I hope other people can help us figure it out, and that they will give us feedback on their own perspectives, as you said, so we can also continue to learn. So that wraps up the final part of our discussion on communication. I felt lighter after exploring all the different ideas and stories in this series. It was like expressing things I knew inside, but didn't quite have the words for. Shankar, what's your biggest takeaway from this entire series?
First of all, thanks for sharing that, Nikhil, about how you felt about the whole series. What I learned was that communication can evolve along different directions. You outlined some excellent strategies to improve communication, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes communication can just peter out or is not possible and can even result in estrangement. That's definitely a whole topic by itself. Some might say a podcast could be dedicated to it. However, I do believe that regardless of how communication evolves, whether it be positive growth in understanding and the blossoming of an intergenerational relationship, or it reaches a steady state, or even just a static phase, or peters out completely, we can always get to acceptance, understanding, and peace, which is in some sense the ultimate goal anyway. The Munis do seem to indicate to us that all the shards of the mirror only get reunited in that state beyond words, in the peace that passeth understanding. Nikhil, what's your biggest takeaway?
Wow, let me just pause to say that was both beautiful and poetic, and a great summation of the series. My biggest takeaway actually has to do with something you shared on the last episode. Parents being hesitant or afraid to speak up around their kids for fear of losing their last channel of communication with them. I have to admit, when you brought it up, I heard you and I accepted it, but I didn't fully embrace it. But since we recorded that last episode, I've heard from some of our audience around this, and how much the idea resonated with them and was true to their own experience. And so it's really opened my eyes to something that I didn't really realize was happening, or maybe it was the experience of parents. So it's something I'll take forward coming out of the series. And it's a good reminder, really, to me, that no matter what generation we're a part of, we all have a part to play in creating a safe environment to communicate, and for others to feel safe communicating with us. So that's my biggest takeaway.
Wow, I'm so impressed. The fact that you were open minded and you held that perspective provisionally as something valid, and then you were able to come to maybe a firmer and deeper appreciation of it after listening to others, just speaks volumes for your open-mindedness and for your ability to embrace a different perspective, which may not just naturally occur. That's just amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I should have never doubted you. That's my takeaway. I should have never doubted you there.
It's so sweet of you and kind of you to say that. But it seems to me that that was actually the very intent of our podcast playing out in real life. We do these things spontaneously. I think that viewpoint came as a surprise to you, probably when you first heard it. But that's that sort of live and active, spontaneous interaction that I really treasure in our podcast, and trying to sort of serve as a model or as an example for how this can really work very, very well if we're both open-minded about it. And for my part, I have to say that learning from you the importance of listening and deep listening, like at level 2 or level 3, and the idea of asking questions, open-ended questions, without judgment and without jumping in to give advice. These are really things that have resonated with me and I'll carry forward.
Yeah, it's almost like the idea of chai across generations is a good idea.
You got me there. So, well, dear listeners, I do have a little addition to our last request. So, putting on my professor hat, it's time to do your homework. Go to your phone, record a 2 minute soundbite answering the question, what was your favorite episode and why? And email it to chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com or send it to us on Instagram at chaiacrossgenerations.
We'll feature that in an upcoming episode. Shankar, do the first three entries get extra credit?
That's the problem with your generation. You always want something extra or special dispensation. Look, the work is its own reward.
Hey, we learned from the best, so thank you and everyone in your generation.
Okay, you got us there. All right, that's it for now. As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a review on Spotify. You can get extra credit for that or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, Shankar. See you all next time.